The magic of cinema extends beyond cultural boundaries. Show me the cinema of a society and I will tell you what's going on among its people. Why do we love movies when the avenues for entertainment are plenty and when social media has made us the hero of our content? We love movies because they speak to us, no matter what our background, because they speak to what's common among us, what makes us human. We love movies because they speak for those among us who do not have a voice. We watch movies because movies matter to us. They inspire us, make us laugh, cry, instill fear. But most important of all, movies make us empathize. The trials and tragedies, the joys and hopes of a society are captured by the cinema of its time. The characters, the stories, the music are all symbolic of the happenings in a society. They represent the aspirations and struggles of the people. To see how Hindi cinema has reflected society over time, let's take a look at the period of post-independence India and its influence on our cinema. When the British rule ended in India in 1947, India achieved independence, and with it, the hopes and aspirations of millions of Indians were set high. A belief that we were now in charge of our destiny. A belief that we could finally build a progressive and equitable society.
At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
When India got its independence, farming households, which comprised 82% of the population, had suffered long and hard under the zamindari system, which gave land rights to a landed aristocracy and was convenient from the viewpoint of tax collection and administration. We will very often see in the cinema of the 50s that the villain is played by the feudal lord. In the films of the 1950s, we see that Zamindar Sahab, Thakur Sahab, Raja Sahab or Rai Sahab are symbolic of the villainy of the feudal system that oppressed its masses.
शंभू महतो की तरफ हमारे कितने रुपए चाहिए हैं?
खाता देखना पड़ेगा।
देख लीजिए और उसे कल यहाँ बुलवाइए।
बहुत अच्छा हुजूर।
Here we see how Shambhu Mahato is manipulated and exploited by Thakur Harnam Singh to usurp a piece of land to build a large mill and bring ruin to a community of farmers.
यहाँ एक मिल लगवाऊंगा, तमाम रास्ते पक्के बनवा दूंगा, घर घर बिजली की बत्तियां जला करेंगी, तुम सबकी भलाई होगी।
हजूर हमारे माई बाप हैं, आप हमारी भलाई ना करेंगे तो और कौन करेगा?
मगर ये सब तुम लोग समझते कहाँ हो, फिर भी इन सब में तू समझदार है। ले जरा अंगूठे का निशान तो लगा दे इस कागज पे।
इसमें क्या लिखा है हजूर?
अरे कुछ नहीं, वही गोपीपुर में मेरी जमीन के साथ लगती हुई जो तेरी 2 बीघा जमीन है वो मुझे चाहिए, वही मैं मिल लगवा रहा हूँ। ले अंगूठा लगा दे झट से।
जमीन तो किसान की माँ है हजूर, माँ को बेच दूं?
अबे रहने दे, जमीन पर मिल लग जाने से माँ बाप बन जाएगी।
But what about the hero? The person who rebels against an establishment. India's freedom struggle was special because from the 1920s it was founded on Mahatma Gandhi's doctrine of Satyagraha, a non-violent resistance against the British rule. The hero of the 1950s carried forward this legacy where self-harm was glorified as a symbol of heroism. Here we can see how Vijay handles this disillusionment with the world in the last scene of the cult classic Pyasa, released in 1957.
मुझे शिकायत है उस तहजीब से, उस संस्कृति से, जहाँ मुर्दों को पूजा जाता है और जिंदा इंसान को पैरों तले रौंदा जाता है, जहाँ किसी के दुख दर्द पे तो आंसू बहाना बुज़दिली समझा जाता है, छुप के मिलना है कमजोरी समझा जाता है। ऐसे माहौल में मुझे कभी शांति नहीं मिलेगी मीना, कभी शांति नहीं मिलेगी। इसलिए मैं दूर जा रहा हूँ, दूर।
As India marched ahead into the 1960s, it looked at its future with optimism. the first Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, was keen to build a socialistic model of polity which was incorporated in the preamble of our constitution and laid the foundation for a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. He believed that the economic progress was key to lifting millions out of poverty, and he went about industrialization and building what he called the temples of modern India, in industries like steel, mining, and power generation. In a socialistic milieu, the capitalist represented the bad guy, and we see this in the cinema of the 60s. The films of the 1960s often portrayed the mill owner as a symbol of capitalism, a person who represents what society considered unfair and vile.
किस बात की बेइंसाफी? मैंने क्या जुर्म किया? मिल का मालिक होना जुर्म है, या मिल के मजदूरों को हर महीने पूरी तनख्वाह देता हूँ ये जुर्म है, या जिन लोगों को आधे वक्त खाना नहीं मिलता है उनको नौकरी देता हूँ ये भी जुर्म है?
नहीं, ये जुर्म नहीं है। नौकरी देना जुर्म नहीं है, मिल का मालिक होना भी जुर्म नहीं। जो धन मजदूरों के हिस्से का है उसे मजदूरों से छीन लेना जुर्म।
कौन सा धन? क्या उन लोगों ने इस मिल में रुपया लगाया है? उन्होंने रुपया लगाया नहीं, रुपया पैदा किया।
While the mill owner was the new face of capitalism and villainy, we see the vestige of the old privileged class in Hindi cinema. The only shift you can see is that the privileged class that ruled the villages of India in the 1950s had moved to the cities, and increasingly we see this class in an urban environment.
अरे बेटी, कुंवर साहब को कौन नहीं जानता? दिल्ली के मशहूर घरानों में यही तो एक खानदान बाकी है जिससे पुराने वक्तों की शान कायम है।
इज्जत अफजाई का बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया शंकर दयाल जी।
The decade of the 60s added 30 million people to urban India, a number that had previously taken 2 decades to add. This urbanization begins to manifest itself in the movies of the 1960s with a shift towards more urban settings. This urban shift in exposure in the cinema of the 60s gave us a hero who was a rebel, but only with a limited scope. The hero's rebellion in the 60s was not a rebellion against the world, but a rebellion against his world, which comprised of his parents and family.
ने अपने बेटे को पाल पोस कर इतना बड़ा किया, और आज वही बेटा ये कह करके चला गया कि वो उसके लिए मर चुका है।
माँ तुम समझती क्यों नहीं? मैं उस लड़की से मोहब्बत करता हूँ माँ, मैंने उसे शादी का वचन दिया है।
और उस वचन का क्या होगा जो तुम्हारे पिताजी बचपन से कहीं और दे चुके हैं?
मैं उस वचन के लिए अपनी मोहब्बत को कुर्बान नहीं कर सकता माँ।
After 1947, India's economy was steadily shifting from an agricultural economy towards greater industrialization. We can see a steady increase in the contribution of manufacturing to India's GDP.
Japan mal, radio cassette, I see. Sab, you sell me this? Sell me? Japan mal? 1800 rupees. No? 2000 rupees. Cash. No? This is a very good set. Bush Baron, made in India. I bought it from there.
Now available in 2 models. Bush, the number 1 2-in-1.
This shifting economic profile led to a greater urbanization, which can be seen in the fact that India had just 76 Class 1 towns post-independence, which had an increase threefold to 218 by the time we exit the decade of the 70s. Urbanization brought with it its own issues, and we can see how the villain in Hindi cinema gradually changed from the capitalist to the urban gangster, the smuggler or the black marketeer.
बड़ी बड़ी बातें करनी तो मुझे भी बहुत आती है, लेकिन एक बात मत भूलिए डीएसपी साहब कि सारा शहर मुझे लॉयन के नाम से जानता है, और इस शहर में मेरी हैसियत वही है जो जंगल में शेर की हो.
It's important to note that by the time the 70s arrived, the people of India were disillusioned and the optimism and dream of a great country was shattered. It was also this time when faith in public institutions was low. The decade also saw a period of emergency. It was a period when extra-constitutional forces had damaged the democratic dream that India had fought for. In this era of disillusionment, we see the birth of a vigilante, a hero who doesn't believe that the world is a fair and just place, and if he wants to succeed or even survive, he will have to fight for what is just and rightfully his. This scene from Diwar, released in 1975, paints a vivid picture of the times. The youth moving from its villages to its cities to fulfill the needs of their families back home. And the birth of a vigilante who knows that there is only one way to deal with the oppression, and that is to be judge, jury, and executioner. The persona of the angry young man, played by Amitabh Bachchan through the 1970s, beginning with Zanjeer in 1973 and continuing through the 70s with films like Diwar, broke away from the hero of the 50s and the 60s. The angry young man, which captured the cinema of the 1970s, was born at a time when India was experiencing high unemployment among its youth. At a time when no one was listening to the grievances of the common man, is the time when the angry young man of the 70s gave voice to the common man and made Amitabh Bachchan the man of the masses.
जो 25 बरस में नहीं हुआ वो अब होगा. अगले हफ्ते एक और कुली इन मवालियों को पैसा देने से इनकार करने वाला है.
ले जाता है. माल निकाल. मुंह क्या देख रहा है? पैसे फेंक. पियला है क्या?
By the time we moved into the 80s, the economic landscape of India was transitioning to a mixed economy. The decade of the 1980s saw the highest jump in GDP of any decade that we had seen post-independence. This led to a large number of people who entered the Indian middle class in the 1980s. However, India still remained a largely poor country. We can see this from the headcount index of poverty, which touched 70% in the 60s, but was still around 60% into the 80s. It wouldn't be until the 90s that poverty would break from its past. In the cinema of the 80s, the social unrest of the 70s becomes more evident.
ये आम आदमी अब समझ गया है कि आप न कभी उसे इन भेड़ियों से बचाएंगे न इस दुनिया के दालचनों से. अब अपनी लड़ाई उसे खुद लड़नी है.
We see a further loss of faith in the system with the politician as the villain in films. It is noteworthy that our politicians who were held in high esteem by the people at the time of independence were now denigrated to villains, an idea which was quite unthinkable 3 decades ago.
40 बरस में आप हर इंसान को तन ढकने के लिए एक जोड़ा कपड़ा न दे सके, कोई बात नहीं. 40 बरस में आप हर इंसान को सर छुपाने के लिए एक छत नहीं दे सके, कोई बात नहीं. 40 बरस में आप हर इंसान को तालीम नहीं दे सके, रोजगार नहीं दे सके, दवा इलाज नहीं दे सके, कोई बात नहीं. 40 बरस में 40 बरस में आप इंसान को एक गिलास पानी नहीं दे सकते तो क्या कर सकते हैं आप?
We also see the high unemployment rates of the 70s and the 80s starting to reflect in themes of exploitation of unemployed youth for meeting the politicians' avarice. The institutional corruption of the 70s and 80s had become endemic and a cause for repetitiveness and fatigue amongst moviegoers. This led to instances where the villain was a caricature of villainy. He didn't belong to any section of society like we saw in the past instances of zamindars, capitalists and politicians.
नहीं समझे, समझ जाओगे.
Villainy was his only vocation, and the characters became some of the most memorable to appear on cinema screens.
Mogambo, खुश हुआ.
The frustration of the people with the times and the endemic nature of injustice gave rise to a more violent hero. The films of the 1980s featured popular actors like Anil Kapoor, Jackie Shroff, and Mithun Chakravarti. These were some of the most violent films to appear on our screen. Vendetta was a popular theme in the 80s. The nexus between the politician and the police is perhaps best brought out through the Vijay Tendulkar written and Govind Nilhani directed Ard Satya. The subtext of the film is a political and psychological commentary told through the story of the police officer. Ard Satya remains one of the early pieces of realism in cinema to shine light on the invisible thread that bound democratic institutions to unlawful activity. The decade of the 80s had seen some major political events such as Operation Blue Star, the assassination of Prime Minister Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the anti-Sikh riots and Operation Black Thunder in Punjab, which brought militancy to the forefront. Towards the end of the 80s into the 90s, the problem of militancy in Kashmir became a major threat to India's national security. Terrorism was now a part of people's lives and dominated news headlines. In this socio-political climate, for the first time, we saw films where militancy and terrorism were key themes, and the antagonist represented a terror group. While terrorism was a natural backdrop for the villain, there were films like Marches, which was sensitive to the use of militancy as a political tool that people took to for getting justice to a community, as well as brought to the fore how it destroyed lives and led ordinary people to take extreme measures.
देख बाबू, जब किसी आदमी के साथ बेइंसाफी होती है ना, और होती चली जाती है, अकेले वो लड़ नहीं पाता, तब वो अपनी तरह के और लोगों को इकट्ठा कर लेता है, कभी मोहल्ले और शहर के नाम पर, कभी जाति या धर्म के नाम पर, देश के नाम पर, लेकिन उसकी लड़ाई होती उसी बेइंसाफी के खिलाफ है। जब चाहो इतिहास उठाकर देख लो, यही होता रहा है, यही होता रहेगा।
तो फिर कानून किस लिए है?
कानून से कभी मसले हल हुए हैं? सुनते हो ना, इंक्वायरी कमीशन, इंक्वायरी 10 साल 20 साल चलता रहता है। मैं किसी आने वाली नस्लों के लिए नहीं लड़ रहा हूं, मुझे अपना हक चाहिए, और वो भी मेरे जिंदा रहते हुए, अभी इसी वक्त।
The period of the 90s was also significant because the year 1991 represented a watershed in India's economic history. Forced by an economic crisis, India's foreign exchange reserves hit rock bottom and could barely finance 3 weeks of imports. The global rating agencies such as Moody's downgraded India's bond ratings, making it difficult to raise short-term loans. India was forced to seek a bailout from the World Bank, and as a precondition, would open up its economy to participation from foreign entities. India, being a huge market with an expanding middle class, held great business potential, and we see an influx of brands, products, ideas, and influences which changed the way our youth looked at the world and their future. In the films of the 90s, we noticed a shift of aspirations, dreams, and desires. We now begin to see a shift in the attitudes of our audiences. In the 90s, the Indian who served his country and cared about its social issues, the Indian who wanted to effect change in his country's system and polity, the Indian who came to represent the hero, was now increasingly being replaced by the non-resident Indian, the NRI, who for the longest period had served as sort of a counter-model in films like Purab aur Paschim and Des Pardes. The influences of liberalization had made the NRI an aspirational Indian, a successful capitalist, technology-savvy, devout Hindu, all rolled in one. This role model that came to be ignited new trends in fashion and aspirations for global travel and tourism. The 1990s was the age of the NRI, who came to represent dreams and aspirations of the new middle class in an increasingly liberalized economy. The pursuit of wealth, the pursuit of comfort, was now gaining mainstream acceptance and importance. Pursuit of wealth and opulence, which defined the villain in an earlier age, sometimes as the oppressive zamindar, at other times as the entitled capitalist and later as the avaricious bootlegger, was increasingly becoming the aspiration of the majority. The observer can see a raising of bar on aspiration accelerated by global forces and our own liberalization. This raising of bar, supported by growth in per capita income after the decade of the 90s, has led to more international sensibility in mise-en-scène or setting for enactment of stories told today. We can therefore see that there is a less clear definition of the villain today in Hindi cinema compared to the early decades post-independence. And that is owing to the fact that the gap in aspiration, morality, and the meaning of a life well lived that defined the hero and the villain of an earlier decade has now narrowed. Beyond the 2000s, we see a slow but sure coming of age of Hindi cinema. We see films coming closer to life and its characters comfortable and open about their flaws and frailties. We see the discussion of contemporary issues and social attitudes through story and style never seen before on the Hindi film screen. We see a renewed nationalism expressed in line with the times, far from the excessive jingoism of previous decades.
सब एक गिलास पानी लो ना। पानी लो पानी 25 पैसे का एक गिलास। 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 We realize that the filmmaker makes what's contemporary. Data and trends are lagging indicators and help us make connections with events, cohorts, and epochs only in retrospect. The filmmaker's cinematic sensibilities, their choice of subject, their use of language, their choice of music is all influenced by and reflects the society they grew up in. As we continue to enjoy entertainment in cinema and continue to be influenced by it, cinema will continue to seek inspiration from us. There are stories yet to be told, heroes yet to be seen, and villains, be it in flesh and blood or demons of our own design, yet to be defeated. As the popular phrase goes, picture Ravi Baki hai mere dost.